Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your patience. I am so excited to be here today with Martell Teasley, the Dean of the College of Social Work at the University of Utah. He's in his second term as president of the National Association of Deans and Directors of Social Work, and as the lead investigator on the social work profession's grand challenge to eliminate racism. His major area of research interest are African American adolescent development, school social work practice, and diversity in social work education. Martell, thank you for being here. I really, really appreciate it.
Dr. Singer, thank you for your time, and I'm really pleased to be here with you today.
So I want to start out by acknowledging that we have learned of yet another murder of a Black man by police officers. This one happened back in March. Daniel Prude, who was having some sort of mental health emergency. Police were called out. They put a what they call a spit hood over his head, and they suffocated him, and he died. Subsequently, the video of the incident was of the killing was released, and 7 police officers have been suspended. And I bring this up because it's happening right now. It has been happening. We've had an entire, we've had 400 years, but more immediately in the last, this summer, we have had an uprising, a reckoning around issues of race and racism. And your work really does, has been, on the forefront of this for years. And so I wanted to say that social work students have been very vocal and active in addressing racism and white supremacy in schools of social work. And if social work faculty have not previously addressed racism and white supremacy in the curriculum, they spent the summer redoing their syllabi, attending trainings on decolonizing the syllabi and addressing white supremacy in schools of social work, as well as confronting colleagues. And the actions of students and faculty have been very public. Now, I know you can't speak for all deans and directors, but I'm curious what you've seen deans and directors doing to respond to the legacy of racism and white supremacy in social work and social work education.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm not fully aware of all of what deans are doing, but I have heard quite a bit as president of NAD. And deans are still dealing with such issues. And NAD itself has developed an anti-racist statement. And we're now considering developing metrics for that statement on how we hold ourselves accountable.
And by
Also,
NAD, you mean the National Association of Deans and Directors,
yes,
which you were in your second term president of.
right.
Yes,
And
exactly.
so, yeah, so, but programs, that is something that's near and dear to us as anti-isms as a part of social work education and programming and practice. I think one of the big challenges that we have is that we basically connect clinicians, most of us, even though there's the big macro piece of social work, and there's been a real bifurcation between macro practice and clinical practice, as you know. And most of what we do is aimed right now at clinical practice and how we engage with clients in terms of anti-racist behavior, making sure we don't engage in microaggressions, a lot of effective approaches. That's all fine and well, but it is really policy and policy analysis that has to deal with systemic racism. So I think that's where the scramble you're talking about may come from in
Right.
terms of understanding what the curriculum looks like. And many students get into social work to do something about the conditions and context of challenges within their own communities. And when they don't find what's needed within the curriculum, they're a little bit disturbed by that. And so we've seen some challenges in social work education programs because of that. But again, I think deans and directors and department chairs are very serious about meeting the challenge of our times. And so there's still dialogue going on about that. We are actually doing that here at the University of Utah, for example. So within the past couple of years, we started a framework for assessment of our curriculum, and what's in the literature, what's in particular courses in terms of the literature, how we recruit and how we retain people of color, including myself, and faculty. I basically started asking the question recently of what internships we're in. Well, we serve in communities, we serve minority clients, but how many of our internships are in minority communities at those agencies? They need interns also. So that has thrown the faculty for a loop, and we're dealing with those types of issues. I think one of the challenges also is that because we haven't seen, and the video camera has done so much for us of recent. Of course, this has been happening all my life in terms of Black men being killed. Uh, when I grew up, I saw this. I just thought it was a norm. The cell phone and the video camera have helped America understand that this is a gross challenge, and this is a problem in terms of why many African Americans are very distrustful of police. I think the real challenge here, as you started talking about and I haven't seen anything about what happened in Rochester, but what I do know is there seems to be this presupposition that we need to control Black men and Black bodies. And that goes back historically, everyone knows about that. And that presupposition is part of the socialization process that people gain within our, in our upbringing. And so one goes to the police force, and there probably is very little that takes away from that. If you read, for example, Khalid Muhammad's Condemnation of Blackness, it's a book I'm reading now, he traces the challenge of community policing and policing which started in the slave trade, in terms of slave patrols, in terms of policing slaves. And one of the things he talks about, which is very interesting, was the riots of 1919, which is about 100 years from now, back, where whites turned on Blacks in communities because in terms of the labor markets, they were bringing Blacks in as scabs. We've called scabs in terms of having a workforce to come in when there were strikes. And whites in St. Louis and Chicago and other places, basically, they were tired of this, so they attacked Blacks. And then police were sent out to actually help break up the riots. And some of them helped actually start killing Black people. And they had this big commission to talk about this. And they said, why did you basically attack the people you were supposedly help? And they basically said, we didn't know, but we don't really like Black people. So there was this perceived bias against Blacks. And they said that openly about 100 years ago. Now we don't say that so much openly, but it's still taking place. And so the whole notion of a colorblind society where we don't see race is extremely problematic, when most of our society was built upon race and the foundation of it is built upon race. As I've heard someone say recently, we live in a racist society, but we don't want to be labeled as racist people. One of the challenges is that while we live in a racist society, we seem to think of racism in terms of the individual level. So we don't want to be individually named as racist. But it is a particular social problem, and it's a systemic problem that we need to tackle in the larger society, as well as within social work education.
There's so much to unpack with what you just said.
Yes.
And I agree that, this perpetual problem in social work about the bridge between the micro and the macro, um, thinking about racism as an individual construct, at a micro level, is problematic
Yeah.
because of the systemic nature of racism. And even though the words might change, the attitudes have not.
Right.
There are systems that continue to reinforce this. And so I want to find out from you. And again, I realize that we had Laura Abrams and Alan Detlef in a previous Facebook Live talking about defunding the police, and Alan's a dean and Laura's a director, and you're president of the deans and directors. And so I'm asking you, they weren't speaking as deans and directors, they were speaking as themselves on this
Sure.
Facebook Live, but I'm excited for you to be able to speak about deans and directors with this question about placements, right? That you talked about, these issues of retention of faculty of color, staff of color. What is the role of deans and directors? What of the whole pie that we think about, right? What is the function of the dean and the director in terms of moving schools to being anti-racist and addressing these systemic issues so that as we move forward, um, we have structural change.
Sure. Well, you know, the major thing for deans and directors is to create program equity and opportunity for faculty and staff and students so that we get a relevant and quality education. You know, we're basically we're middle managers. And I've said this recently. I had an interview with President Watkins, the president of our university, Ruth Watkins. And what I said to her was that diversity and inclusion works best when the university is striving towards that as well as the academic unit. So if any dean and director, him, her, or their self, is trying to achieve a balance between or discuss racial and ethnic problems and creating opportunity for students and retention. If the greater university is not into that, that makes it extremely hard. And so you need both. And what I also said to her is like, we have tenure and promotion standards at our university. So while people change, those standards don't change. We might tinker with them a bit, and we have to go through the faculty senate to make sure that we adjust them, but they're in place and everybody understands what they are. The same thing needs to be done into diversity and inclusion, that there needs to be a framework for assessment of diversity and inclusion within social work education programs that is an ongoing process that gets at this all the time. So here at the College of Social Work at the University of Utah, I've been very mindful of that. And so we're not trying to be episodic to just address the problems that have happened more recently, but to have this as an ongoing piece of who we are, that we're always looking at diversity and inclusion, we're evaluating it, and we're engaging in a feedback loop. So we actually bought a climate survey from the University of Michigan, and we tinker with it to develop it in terms of our own needs at the University of Utah. We'll look at that every 2 years. We'll have that climate assessment. We'll disaggregate that data by gender, by ethnicity, by sexual orientation, and we'll look at how well we're doing here. And then we'll take that information and put it in a feedback loop and try to improve on what we're doing. We'll continuously do that on an ongoing basis. That is part and parcel the job of deans, directors, and department chairs in terms of diversity and inclusion.
And and I want to say that there's been a lot of conversation on the thread, which I really appreciate. And I just want to give a shout out to folks. We got Dorlissa, Lorraine Gutierrez, Elena Gormley, and Jessica Donahue. And actually, I don't know, Jessica, how to pronounce your last name. So I'm going to butcher it. Dio. And thank you all for your comments. Please make sure that you're commenting. You can say where you're from, ask questions. As you can see, I've already started to integrate your comments into this discussion. And it's one of the things that makes this most powerful, to have this interactive. And so, you know, Martell, when you were talking, I really got the idea of the dean as putting in the directors putting in the structure to say, are the efforts that we're doing in a school, are they working? How
Yeah.
can we measure it? What are the metrics? And I think all of those things are that's that management function, right,
Yes.
of the dean and the director. Now, one of the comments in the thread was that that schools of social work for a long time have trained social workers to be tools of racist control, right? That that schools of social work train social workers to be part of the social control function of societies. And I know that sort of control and social control, these are concepts that largely come out of sociology. Um, do deans and directors have a role to play in addressing the sort of this control function that social work that social workers, future social workers, play through their what they learn in their education, or is that part of a different division of the school? And I'm asking because I think it would be helpful for folks to hear again what the responsibilities and the duties are of sort of the administrators, and then the rest of the academic body.
So in terms of social control as a function, we all live in a racist society, and social work programs were developed in that society, and they're part of that, whether we like it or not. And from an anti-racist perspective, racism is a part of us, and we have to admit that. I was socialized in a very racist society, and some of that is in me, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to get that out. And so if we look at the work of Ibram Kendi, he said that Black folk can be racist too, and I would agree with that. And so we may not want to realize that, but that is part and parcel of who we are. Now, social workers have always went against the grain in terms of the status quo when it left out oppressed populations. And I think in some ways we've lost that function. We've become stewards of academia and all things academia. There's been some talk now of what we do to give people tenure and promotion who do community-based work. And we're basically on the article-driven approach to tenure and promotion. But if we look at modern dance on campus, they don't do research articles. And so it is not impossible to develop tenure in another like, for lack of better language, so that there are ways in which we engage in community-based practice to help to do something about the conditions and the context within communities, particularly minority communities, for oppressive practices that hinder communities. And so there is systemic racism. I had a question about that the other day. Someone can just pull up the Ferguson report that the Department of Justice engaged in. We had a situation there where people were given tickets that were out of their control, beyond their socioeconomic status. Fines doubled. We basically created in Ferguson, Missouri, they basically created a debtor's prison in many ways. And so you basically had a all-white police force basically controlling and dominating a Black community. And we have Fergusons all over the country, and they just pop up, because of the institutional racism. There's something which I refer to as racial common sense thinking, which in terms of whatever we do, we always revert back to the status quo. And social work is a part of that also, because part of us wants to go along to get along. And it's pretty hard to go against the grain. Our heyday was why am I blanking on this, the progressive era. We were not so much ingrained in academia at that time. We were out there marching, doing in the streets, and now we've become part of the ivory tower. And if we remember back, it was in the 1940s when the federal government put copious amounts of money into psychiatric social work, which really caused a real chasm and split in the profession, this micro-macro problem that we have now. And I found a quote in a book where Jane Addams said, hey, these new psychiatric people are kind of taking over, because she was much more so for advocacy. But I'll also say about Jane Addams is she cut her teeth actually in terms of charity work and working in Black charity organizations. And then she went on to found Whole House and excluded Black people. And so then she went along to help white immigrants coming into the country. So there's racism inside the profession there. And so there's a lot for all of us to be accountable for. The first thing we need to do is admit that it's there. I always joke that I want to start a group like Alcoholics Anonymous, where we all sit around a circle and stand up and first say, I am a racist, and go from there in terms of our anti-Semitic tropes, our anti-Black tropes, et cetera, in terms of race and ethnicity. Those things have been ingrained in us, and it will take some time to get them out of our society. And social work should be a part of that. Deans and directors have that responsibility. But again, many times we're isolated inside the academy. We don't have the power of other disciplines such as business and engineering on campuses. And so therefore we don't have the voice. But there are people within our profession that push back. To be a radical, to take on the system can be a very lonely thing at times. So that's why we find strength in numbers, and that we have to unite and talk about and do these things together.
Yes, and um, so one, I know that I appreciate, and I know that folks on the thread appreciated you acknowledging the racist foundations of social work with Jane Addams, and I like how you um, acknowledge that there might have been parts of Jane Addams' work that was using Ibram Kendi's sort of concepts of segregation, assimilation, and anti-racist. That there might have been some assimilationist, if maybe possibly anti-racist, but then sort of the go along to get along
Yeah.
firmly put her into the segregationist, racist camp. And what that makes me think of is, yes, we've had one summer where white faculty in particular have been able to kind of focus and have decided that this is important, and that the regression to the mean, to use a research term, or the go along to get along,
Yeah.
is likely to push us again towards um, uh, maintaining the racist control function of social work unless we actively fight that on a regular basis. And one of the things that I heard you say that could create structural change is to not only change field placements for students, but for faculty to reconsider what the tenure and promotion standards are, what the
Yeah.
incentives are, what counts, what is valuable. What should faculty do? And again, if this is not something that is standard, then let me know. But what what should faculty expect that deans and directors can do to affect change in tenure and promotion standards, so that we can have this be a structural change that helps us to move towards anti-racism, which Lorraine Gutierrez acknowledged was the more macro or systemic term, as opposed to anti-racist being a more individual perspective.
So the first thing is I want to say that I don't like dichotomous thinking, so it's not either or. And that doesn't mean that I'm against rigorous research and evidence-based approaches. I think all social workers understand what happened when we didn't engage in evidence-based approaches to what we do. So that's here to stay, and that's not a problem. But there is room for research in communities. We have single subject designs. There should probably be a much more concerted effort in terms of training and producing scholars who can engage in rigorous research in communities for community-based practice. And along with that, looking at that in terms of promotion and tenure standards. It is not the case anymore that we can't do rigorous research in terms of qualitative approaches to practice. We can. And so I'm not really demeaning the whole system of tenure and promotion, that it needs some adjustments though, in terms of what people are doing to make a difference. Also, I would say that in even thinking about the whole notion of eliminating racism, some people scoff at that. Look, we attempt to eliminate cancer. Some forms of cancer we've gotten rid of. We've got anti-Alzheimer's associations. We try to get rid of long-term problems. And we pick up the mantle on those problems over life cycles. And so they may not happen in my time. So for any dean and director out there, I would challenge, what is your contribution at this time? What legacy will you leave? What will you do with your time and service as a leader? And so that is the task for me and everyone else. What do I do with my time, and how do I pass that baton on to other generations of deans and directors and leaders? I really like, and some people may not like, I'm not taking a side on here, but just think about the advocacy of the anti-abortion group. Do we realize how long it took to get a fetus on a billboard?
Mm.
I mean, that group has stayed at it, no matter what side you're on in terms of pro-abortion or not. You just really have to admire their advocacy, and they will stay with it. And so that is what we have to do about racism. We have to be vigilant. We have to stay with it, and we have to transform. We did see, we looked at sports, and when I saw the NBA players go on strike, I basically said it's about time, because this has just been something that has been going on for a long time, and they've been appeased for a while, but it just got too much. And so they sent a clear message that, hey, we have power too. Students have power, faculty have power, department chairs as leaders have power, and we should use that to galvanize people for the betterment of societies and the communities that we serve as social work education programs.
Yes. And so to tie a couple of things together, so you mentioned eliminate racism. Some people scoff at that idea,
Yes.
and that is one of the other main topics that I wanted to ask you about, was this 13th Social Work Grand Challenge that you are um, the lead on, or one of the co-leads on, that you've pushed for, which is eliminate racism. And I will say, my area of expertise is suicide and suicide prevention. In suicidology, we have something called a zero suicide
There you go.
initiative, right? And the idea is that suicide should be a never event. And I think that I hope all of us could get behind the idea that racism and bias and prejudice against people based on the color of their skin should be a never event. And so um, I want to shift away from from the academy specifically,
Sure.
even though I see folks like Desmond Patton, Laura Abrams are commenting on here. It's a great thread. I have to say it's a great thread. So thanks everyone for engaging. Um, uh, just as a quick background, the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare, Rick Barth, Eddie O'Hara, and Marilyn Flynn, and a bunch of others started this initiative called the Grand Challenge for Social Work back in 2014 or 2015. I think it might have been unveiled at the SWR conference. And as one of the co-leads for the Harness Technology for Social Good Grand Challenge, I've been in meetings from almost the beginning of the initiative where people have wondered why there isn't a grand challenge focusing on racism. And the response from the executive committee was that racism was something that needed to be addressed across the 12 grand challenges. But now we have a 13th grand challenge called Eliminate Racism. So can you tell us what changed, and what do you hope to accomplish with this grand challenge?
Sure. Thank you. Well, what changed was greater advocacy, what we're talking about. Myself and others, I was invited to the table as part of the leadership group for Grand Challenges because of being the president of the National Association of Deans and Directors of Social Work. And I came in the door advocating. Prior to that, in 2015, whether people know it or not, myself and one of your previous guests, Mick Journa, I think Larry Davis, and two other people, Ruth McCoy was part of that, and I think James Herbert Williams, we all wrote a letter to Rick Barth, actually basically stating that racism should be a grand challenge. He wrote us back and asked us to write a paper, which I did. It's Success for African American Students. It's on the website there. But that was not enough. Our Native American brothers and sisters complained about a lack of acknowledgement within the grand challenges in terms of the oppressive behavior towards our Native American brothers and sisters, in terms of land sovereignty for them, land acknowledgement for them in many ways. And so we continue to advocate over time. Now, I do think that racism should be in all of the grand challenges, okay? We can't neglect doing that. I mean, how could we even begin to start a smart decarceration project without talking about disproportionality? I think blacks are about 12 to 15% of the population. All of us don't want to be counted sometime. That's why I say 12 to 15%. Don't hope anyone doesn't get upset about that. But we're about 35% of the prison industrial complex. And all of the bogus scientific theories and approaches to say that something's wrong with these people have not panned out. And so there's something wrong with our system. What I would like to see us do within the profession, one is to stay at it. Let me digress for a moment. One reason why we have the grand challenge on racism is that we need to study the centrality of racism itself. That is, race as a central problem within our lives, not as some appendage, but as that thing that's causing harm to people. And we seem to drift away from that in the multicultural world, not saying that other types of approaches, multicultural approaches, are bad, but we don't want to talk about racism because of the scourge and the stain of it. And so we seem to talk about other problems more so, and we leave that one behind. Within our profession, though, if we look at the disproportionality of children within the child welfare system, Black and brown children within the foster care complex, and in my own subject area, school social work, the disproportionality of Black and brown children being suspended from school. Black males are disproportionately suspended in every state within this union. Blacks make up about 14% of the kids in preschool, and they're 48% of the kids suspended from preschool. And so we know this notion of the school to prison pipeline. And then there's the resource officers, and we saw exponentially the referrals to the juvenile justice system go up when we kind of not necessarily remove social workers from school, but introduce more resource officers, that is police to schools. We saw the number of juvenile justice referrals for poor dress codes and other types of things for Black and brown kids exacerbate. Now, we know that if we can just keep a kid, if we can have a kid graduate from high school, he or she is less likely to use general relief or be on SNAP programs for welfare support. Now, we have many social welfare programs. Schools are social welfare programs, so within itself. So I wouldn't want to say that they wouldn't use social welfare programs. Social Security is a social welfare program. It's just a much more favorable one that we contribute money to. But if we could stop what's going on inside the profession and our role in the disproportionality of Black and brown kids in the foster care system, in school, the school to prison pipeline, and in the juvenile justice system, that would be fundamental and instrumental as a start in terms of eliminating racism in this society.
So those are really, those are big, right? And those are important. And I know that in past conversations, there have been calls to defund police, defund child welfare. People have even called for defunding NASW and social work.
Lights just went off. I'm sorry, I got to wave my hand.
That's okay. You actually look good. You look
Okay,
good.
good.
Yeah. This is the unintended consequences of being environmentally conscious.
That's right.
So these are all really big things. And, earlier there was a comment saying that there was sort of the sense that a lot of white faculty just sort of discovered racism for the first time this semester. How do we keep it going? And there's a related comment. How do we ensure that the grand challenges are actually enacting long-term meaningful change rather than being able to point to the fact that we now have a 13th grand challenge called Eliminate Racism and saying, see, we did it. Like we did it. We're doing this. Just don't pay attention to us anymore. Like how are we going to make sure this actually does something?
Well, I think that the authors of the Grand Challenges, that is the American Academy, and now we have the Grand Challenges Committee led by Rick Barth, they want to keep this going. And one thing I haven't said to that committee, that there are a lot of people who were absent because of the lack of racism. I think this may motivate more people to gain interest in the grand challenges. Go ahead.
Wait, let me just say. So when you say the lack of racism, could you?
In the grand challenges, yes.
Right. So I just want to make sure that you're saying that people were not engaged in the
Yeah,
grand challenge
yeah,
because the grand challenges didn't acknowledge
right,
racism as being something that was worthy of being one of our grand challenges. Okay,
right.
I just wanted to
Yes,
make sure that
thank
we
you
were
for that. Thank
very
you.
clear on that one.
Yeah.
So.
And so I think I got lost my chain of thought there.
No,
But
and I had asked about how are we going to make sure that this actually does something rather than being the sort of the
okay.
shiny thing that people point to and say, "See,
Well,
we did."
these are long-term problems. Mathematics has not solved all of its grand challenges. It's for people within the profession to keep this going, to solve these irretractable problems. And I really believe in all the grand challenges. The ideal of smart decarceration, the ideal of stopping violence, the ideal of reducing homelessness, the ideal of harnessing technology so that we don't leave populations behind. Those are other problems that we'll have. All those things are impacted by race, though. And so in every state that I visit, the predominant amount of men, except maybe here in Utah, I must say, on the streets who are homeless are Black men. And for a long time, many of them were Vietnam vets. And I will say, as I told someone the other day, and this may be off a little bit, that most of my adult life has been about either you go in the military in terms of the Vietnam War, or how do we move closer to putting you in the prison industrial complex through tough on crime, tough on drugs, uh, uh, minimum sentencing guidelines. All of these things really have been aimed at Black and brown men. And they've actually sold Black people in terms of the African American Congress on these problematic approaches to social problems. Look, what we know is that at one point, the Irish up in New York and the Germans in St. Louis and other places had huge problems within their communities, where they did the type of shootings that we see on the south side of Chicago. They were not considered white at the time. They were considered immigrants. Their entree into whiteness meant that we will put money into your community to develop it. And that stopped the killings and the shootings. So what we're seeing now with all of the killings, something we call Black on Black crime, which is really an excuse to blame it on Black people when it's American on American crime, as we know. But that causes us to think that there's something wrong with the people and we don't need to invest in the community because they will tear it down. No, that's not the problem. The problem is that Blacks were the last hired, the first fired, and when union jobs left and went overseas, Black men were the first people who exited factories. And then we saw the proliferation of guns in our communities and drugs, and now we have the explosion of the problems we see there. Now we see this happening to white males in droves and white folks in droves, where their jobs have been shipped overseas. And they were the last of the people who were affected by globalization. Their jobs sent overseas. We're starting to see the opioid crisis. And we're talking about $15 jobs when these people were making $30 and $40 an hour. And many of them don't want retraining. And so they've moved towards substance use and abuse as a way of dealing with their problems. Now, when that came to Black and brown communities, the ideal was that they were going to be predators and we need to lock them up. Now, when it's white males and white folk, what we are saying is that it's a mental health crisis and we're giving them drugs to stop them from overdosing. And that's a good thing. We shouldn't be locking up people for that. But again, we have herds of people in jail for just using crack cocaine, which the mantra at that time was to lock them up, the vicious predators. So we should also see how racism is really harming our society because we're really not getting at the real problems that we have. And the real problem that we have is one of the changing distribution of wealth in this country, where the 1% and the top percent are getting most of the earnings. Within the past 40 to 50 years, the people on the bottom rung of the income ladder have lost about a third of their wealth. African Americans and Hispanics lost about $400 billion during the Great Recession that we have, and they have not recovered from that. And so those are challenges that we have in our community. And racism masks those things and makes us think there's something wrong with the people instead of the society that bore them.
Yes. And uh, and this is where that conversation, the call for reparations, comes in. This is
Yes.
where we see that the wealth gap between white families and black families is about 6 to 1 or
Yeah.
7 to 1, depending on what you're looking at. All of the redlining, preventing people from buying homes, being kept out of jobs because of the color of the skin. All of these things are part of this system. And so again, the um, one of the one of these questions is how, and I'm not, and and I want to be very clear, I'm not, as a white man, asking you as a black man to answer my personal question about racism, because I firmly believe this is the job that I as a white person need to do with other white people, because we created this. And so I'm not asking you in that context, but I am saying, as one of the co-leads
Sure.
for the Eliminate Racism Grand Challenge, what are some of the things that social workers, social work faculty, social workers who are interested in the Grand Challenge do to either be involved, to make sure this moves forward, so that we can do some of the things that you have been talking about?
Sure. Well, first, let me say there's nothing wrong with you asking me questions as a white man. I think that is the polarization we have within our society. The provost wrote an anti-racist statement at the University here of Utah, and he sent it to me to read it and to review it. And he said, I feel odd as a white man writing this statement. And I said, it's really the content of this statement that we're thinking about, not your skin color. And so, that's important to understand. In terms of the grand challenges, how people can get involved in terms of the question that you asked, right now we're writing a book, me and my colleague, Michael Spencer, and Melissa Bartholomew. Michael Spencer is from the University of Washington. Melissa Bartholomew is from Boston College. We are co-editing the book. I'm the lead on eliminating racism as a grand challenge. And so we're doing that. That's the first order. And
Mm-hmm.
so what I've said to people who have contacted me, and I'm actually just finished the book proposal on that. We've got the chapters on that. So next, we're going to have meetings and start to talk about how we tackle this problem as a profession. So we were to introduce this at Swerve and as well as CSWE. Of course, everything is virtual right now. But that doesn't mean that racism certainly will end. It's actually impacted us in terms of the coronavirus, as you know.
Yes.
But we'll get along with that. But again, it's up to us. And one of the things I want to say about this book as I look at the literature, Dr. Singer, is that there's really nothing new under the sun here. If we look closely at the literature, there's been a group of people haranguing about racism in the profession for a long time, white as well as black. In fact, one of the profound statements I found was by John Longris, who basically says, we want to cure racism. We don't really understand what it is as a profession. And so in this book, I want to make sure that one, we understand what racism is, and two, to leave it as an example and a model of what should be done, and to challenge the profession to pick up the mantle to do that. And also to say, and I'm going to say that in the preface, if at some time in the future we haven't done this, we haven't done the things that we're espousing in the book, and there hasn't been a movement in terms of the needle of reducing racism within inside the profession and some of the things I talked about, then we will have failed ourselves. And this would be episodic. There would be a regression to the means, as you say, and what I refer to as racial common sense thinking, because we will revert to the status quo.
Yes, yes. Well, so you have this book coming out, and I think it's great. And I remember the call for chapter authors for that, and and I think that Jessica Donahue on the chat, she acknowledged something that you've mentioned a couple times, which is that there is a rich history of both racism and anti-racism in social work that most people are not aware of. And it sounds like you are going to incorporate some of that into this text, at
Yes.
least as sort of context. And I will say that other folks on the thread have listed several amazing resources that folks should definitely check out. So in the last couple of minutes of our conversation, because I want to be respectful of people's time, especially yours, Dr. Teasley, if there's any last thing that you would like to leave folks with, a vision, a call to action, or a question to ask ourselves, I would be grateful if you could do that.
Well, I would just say thank you for that, and I hadn't thought about that. But you know, we have to challenge ourselves. Talking to like-minded people doesn't really help. You and I are both social workers. As a Jewish American, you are aware of many of the anti-Semitic things, so you certainly would not be pro-racism. As an African American, I would not be. But it's our goal to talk to other people who may have strange ways of thinking about things. And so we have to come to some resolve in terms of that and take on this challenge, come outside of our comfort zone.
Mm.
You know, social workers are in agencies to take on challenges to help people. And so we need to do that in terms of policy, in terms of our own profession. And again, there's strength in numbers. And so we'll get through this. Also, the one thing I've learned in life is the whole notion of never saying never. There are, in many ways, no eternal truths. You and I probably grew up thinking there were 7 planets. Well, we don't know how many planets there are now. And
I
so
know Pluto's not a planet anymore.
that's right. And so things change over time. And so racism can change. And we're all in this for something better than ourselves and a much more fuller and freer humanity. And I just want to make a point about that because some folk think that anti-racism is not about social justice, when it is. If you remember, if you look in the anti-racist literature, it's basically just saying that race is a central problem and we need to pay attention to it in our anti-justice strands. I mean, in our social justice strands, and I bet. So we're all about social justice, but there seems to be a problematic understanding when it pertains to race. So I would challenge all of us to read. You know, I study quite a bit. My area of study, one of them is post-Civil War Reconstruction. So I want to know what's going on there in terms of what happened to Black folk. I think that was a good opportunity for the country to remove itself from an anti-racist society, but it didn't at the time. But I'm constantly finding out new things. And so we have to constantly upgrade our knowledge. And so what we found out yesterday about race may not apply today, or it may apply and it may advance. So keep it up. Let's keep studying. Let's keep trying. And one day we will find some change.
Inspiring words. Dean Martell Teasley, thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts on the role of deans and directors in addressing racism and white supremacy in social work, and for your advocacy in creating the 13th grand challenge of Eliminate Racism. I really appreciate you taking the time to be on this Facebook Live today. And thanks to everyone who posted comments and shared resources and asked questions. I really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to be engaged in this conversation. The audio will be on the Social Work Podcast. The video will be on Facebook. It will also be on the Social Work Podcast YouTube page with transcript. And if you liked what you heard, if you thought this was useful, since we're talking about academia, this is exactly the kind of thing you can assign to students and have them discuss and debate and dive into. So let's keep the conversation going. Martell, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singer, for your time. And thanks to the audience for their time.
And we're out. Okay.
Okay, man.